And and then a copy of this recording will be sent out to all those who registered after the webinar. Y'all should be on mute. We'll just ask that you please keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation as a respect to our presenters. And with that, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Beth. Beth Radow is the State League's issue specialist for environmental issues. She's been working in this role for as long as I've been here with the league, and it's always a delight to work with her. She has a long resume that I really could go on about, but she has an incredible background in both the environmental sciences and the work she does as a lawyer. So I'm going to hand it over to Beth, who's going to talk to us, and then she will introduce our other presenter, Megan. Beth, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erica. Good evening, and thank you all for being here, taking the time to be here tonight with guest speaker Megan Wolff on the topic of plastics, microplastics, and human health. The League has a longstanding commitment to preserving natural resources, air, water, and soil. And in more recent years, the League has established its environmental goals through the lens of the climate emergency. The League supports legislation that favors renewable energy policy and practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, slow climate change, and establish climate justice in communities that are currently disproportionately adversely impacted. Plastic packaging, plastics in general, use hydrocarbons from extracted fossil fuel and produce waste that impacts natural resources with ripple effects to human health. Our health. The League of Women Voters of New York State supports passage of the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act, also called PREA in short, which would require companies with net income over $1 million to sell or distribute certain materials and products, particularly plastic, to reduce packaging, improve recycling and recycling infrastructure, financially support municipal recycling programs, and reduce toxins in packaging. This legislation shifts the onus of recycling from municipalities to producers of products by establishing solutions to sustainable packaging. Thus far, 4 states have implemented similar programs, including Maine, Oregon, Colorado, and California. And now it is New York's turn. In the 2025 legislative session, PREA passed in the Senate, but it was not voted on in the Assembly due to lack of Assembly member support to pass the bill. We will share the recording of this program with members of the Assembly to dispel any misunderstanding that they may have that plastic packaging is the most affordable option and provide the science regarding the adverse health impacts that they and their constituents are exposed to daily with plastic packaging. It is hoped that the facts will inform a vote for this common sense statute favoring the best health interests of their constituents and all of us. While passage of PREA is necessary, it is not sufficient. And by that I mean that even with passage of PREA, which is appropriate and overdue, plastic lives everywhere. And understanding the details can help to shift consumer choices and activities of daily living that will benefit you. While you should be prepared to learn some disturbing facts about health harm from plastics, tonight's program is dedicated to education and taking steps to benefit your good health. Initially, the discussion around the fracking frenzy involving fossil fuel extraction focused on greenhouse gas emissions and a warning about the cumulative impacts of undisclosed chemicals to air, water, and soil. And for environmental health professionals such as Theo Colborn, Pete Myers, and Shauna Swan, among others, the focus lay more specifically with potential adverse health impacts from the endocrine or hormone disrupting chemicals used in fracking operations. More recently, the discussion has centered on hormone disrupting chemicals and their so-called forever chemical counterparts in the proliferating production of plastics derived from fracked ethane and processed propane. In the 1967 movie The Graduate, actor Dustin Hoffman portrays college graduate Benjamin Braddock, who was about to enter the adult world. And while attending a family party, Benjamin receives the unsolicited career advice from Mr. McGuire, who says, I want to say one word to you, Benjamin, just one word, and that word is plastics. Of course, the movie goes on to show the seduction by Mrs. Robinson, who's the mother of Benjamin's love interest. But in addition, Mr. McGuire's prediction about plastics was indeed prophetic when we consider the industry's exponential growth in the decades since and the environmental and health impacts that we experience today. In Plastic Inc., a 2026 expose and history of plastic by investigative journalist Beth Gardner, which I highly recommend, Gardner reports that Carol Muffett, the chief executive officer of the Foundation for International Law for the Environment, discovered through dogged research that during the 1970s, there was commonality of board membership between the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry, and that the tobacco industry's playbook to cast doubt on science appears to have shared its origin with the fossil fuel industry. An industry talking point that grabs the attention of New York legislator holdouts on PREA focuses on the affordability of plastic packaging. Currently, producers bear no responsibility for the packaging waste created by the goods that they sell. And when examining the packaging life cycle, to the extent there are low upfront production costs for plastic, that does not account for the externalized environmental waste management fees. The war in Iran has pushed up the global cost of fossil fuel to new highs, which can be reasonably expected to drive up the cost of all plastic packaging and further weaken the affordability talking point. The true costs of plastic packaging are externalized every day to every one of us in one way or another. One form includes waste that chokes our natural resources, overtakes our landfills, and otherwise degrades and transforms into the health impacts that we experience from the microplastics and nanoplastics present in the air we breathe, the water and the beverages we drink, and the soil and oceans that produce the food we eat. We're paying the costs in diminished health, diminished quality of life, and personalized healthcare expenses. The common sense way to tackle this involves reallocating to producers, as required by PREA, responsibility for streamlining and reconstituting the packaging, and on our part, recycling still and shifting as soon as possible to sustainable consumer choices and swapping plastic convenience for conservation-minded daily practices. Our understanding of health impacts from plastics now benefits from peer-reviewed studies, making the connection personal and the call for action crucial. Tonight, you will learn the science-based facts on health impacts from our guest speaker, Megan Wolff. I will follow up with steps you can take as citizens, Earthwise stewards, and health-wise consumers. It is my pleasure to tell you about our guest speaker, Dr. Megan Wolff, and then turn over this discussion to Megan. Dr. Megan J. Wolff is the executive director of the Physician and Scientist Network Addressing Plastics and Health, also known as PSNAP, a network of physicians and scientists who speak, write, and testify on plastics and human health. From 2022 to 2023, Dr. Wolff served in the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastic and Human Health, which compiled an authoritative report on the health effects of plastic. Dr. Wolff was the health policy director at Beyond Plastics from 21 to 24 and is currently an adjunct faculty member at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University, where she offers an online class on plastics, microplastics, and human health. Dr. Wolff received her master's and her PhD in public health from Columbia University and her Bachelor of Arts in English from Wesleyan University. She lives with her family in New Paltz, New York. Megan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm not muted, am I? No, I'm not. Great. It's really a pleasure to be here. I see a number of faces who I recognize. So hello, it's good to see you again. And I see lots of people who I've never met. And I'm happy to be here either way. Those who have seen me before will see evolution in the slide deck, which reflects evolution in the science. So let's see, I'm sharing my screen. We'll go into slideshow mode. There is always a lot of breaking news in this topic and always a lot to say. I'll try not to talk for more than 3 or 4 hours, although I hear actually we only have a half an hour right now. So we'll try to hold it to that. But let's get started. So, as Beth said, I run the Physician and Scientist Network addressing plastics and health. And the thinking here had to do with a lobby visit that I did in Albany a couple of years back when I was with Beyond Plastics. And I talked about plastics as a mom and as an employee of Beyond Plastics and the health impacts. And the legislator I was talking to was paying no attention. And eventually he turned to me and said, I'm from he named his region. My constituents really don't care about this. And I got angry. I got angry. So, and it was just after the Mindery report had come out. So I said, let's start over. I'm going to reintroduce myself. And I said, I'm Dr. Wolff. And I actually just came off of the Mindery Monaco report on plastics and human health. And I have some things I need to talk to you about. And wow, he started listening. So I understood at that point that the power of a scientist or a physician to be heard on this subject and to get people's attention was pretty significant, and that would be a very good lever or button to hit for trying to make the needle move. And so that's what I've been doing. And we started about 14 months ago with about 6 or 7 people, and we've got 165. So this is an idea whose time has come. Physicians want this, lay people want this, everybody wants this. Um, my background was in history, actually, also English, but I looked at the history of public health and the history of medicine in order to understand where we came from so that we could figure out how to get out of here. And in doing that, I understood that history is not inevitable. And that's good news. We make decisions. People make decisions that cause change, problems that are not inevitable or solvable. And I think the plastics crisis is absolutely solvable because we made it. We didn't even make it very long ago. I will say at the outset that I'm not a plastics abolitionist. If you happen to need the services of a physician in, say, 1860, and you wind up with the tray on the left, we'll all pray for your soul. I would much rather see the tray on the right on my visit to an ER, and a lot of these are very necessary plastics. Though I will say that even on this tray, there are some things that really don't need to be there, that are extra wrapped. There's some packaging we don't need. There are a number of items that don't need to be disposable that have become disposable. So we need to take a judicious look at all of our uses of plastic. But for the most part, we can look at that packaging section. 42% of the plastic under production is for packaging, and start there. What's the plastics crisis? Well, it's nearly 10 billion tons of plastic, mostly still hanging around. And when you look at what it's made of, you can start seeing extra contours of the crisis, not just the fact that it's out there and won't go away, but that it's made out of fossil carbons, so extraction, and chemicals, petrochemicals, to give it its properties, its shapes. And these are synthetic materials. They are man-made, human-made, and they have qualities that are not inert and are not benign, although we were certainly taught to think of plastic as both inert and benign. Frankly, plastic is truly a chemical product, and as such, it has some toxicity issues. Plastics comprise about 70% of the synthetic chemicals industry. They are pegged together. You see one go up, you see the other go up. We manufacture more plastic than pesticides annually, but the majority of the chemicals in plastic are untested. The ingredients are unknown. There's chronic universal human exposure. Plastics haven't really received attention from EPA or even FDA. Actually, that's another class, but they are understudied and overrepresented in our world. Oftentimes we think of them looking like this. They inevitably get into the environment. This is not a litter problem. It's partially a litter problem, but there is truly no system that can contain the plastic that's created, even when it gets into the landfill where it's supposed to go, technically. And here's why. Because plastic doesn't degrade, doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't break down, it breaks up into particles, which we've come to recognize in the last, I'd say publicly, most people in the last 6 or 7 years have heard the term microplastic. So plastic breaks down first from macroplastic, which is, my phone case or a bottle. Anything that's a plastic object is a macroplastic. And then down to microplastics, which are anything smaller than a pencil eraser. But then they get smaller than that. Now we think of microplastics as like pencil eraser to a grain of salt, but they keep on going. Nanoplastics are smaller and smaller and smaller. There's a lively debate going on in most of the chemistry, the physics of plastic, many aspects of the health field asking, is there ever a point that plastic stops being plastic? When it becomes just a small shortened polymer? Can it be a monomer and not be plastic? There are lots of different ways to argue that point, but effectively the answer is mostly no. It just becomes so small that it becomes what we've now realized is you could term bioavailable. So on the right-hand side here, we have microplastics and, size of a grain of salt, a pencil point, and so on. But as it gets smaller and smaller, it goes down to the size of a particle of smoke or the COVID virus or the width of a strand of DNA. Particles that are that tiny are what we call respirable. They can cross the alveoli of the lung and go directly into the bloodstream. And they do. They also cross through the gut. So they move through the intestine and also into the bloodstream. And this is how it is that we've come to start seeing plastic all over the human body. This is the portion of plastic that is being taken into the body. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, first of all, where is it? Well, and how does it get in? It gets in because we can inhale it. It's in the dust, it's on the air, it moves through the currents. All the ecological currents and systems in the world are suffused with plastic. So we inhale it, it's in the water, it can evaporate, micro and nanoplastics evaporate into the hydrological cycle, and they rain and snow down everywhere on the planet, including onto fields and into the food web. And so they're in all parts of the food web. People think about seafood because that's the first place we started thinking and looking for them. But frankly, they're in absolutely everything in the food web. Vegetables, meats, fruits, they're in all of it. There are more of them, by the way, in processed food. And that has a lot to do with food handling and how much plastic is involved in that, and also plasticizing chemicals. Dermal contact, that has more to do with the plasticizing chemicals, the additives in your textiles. 70% of our textiles are made out of synthetic fibers, plastics, and there are lots and lots of different additives in them. As you sweat, your sweat helps to draw those out of your clothes and then dries into your body. So you can absorb plasticizing chemicals through your skin. We all heard the same statistic that some people under some circumstances could eat as much as a credit card a week of plastic. The press picked that up and just said, everybody's eating a credit card of plastic. And, people respond to that in ways that are totally relatable, which is, how do we possibly control this? Since we can't control let's laugh at it. So actually, the internet and the humor world in general has been alive with microplastics memes for some time, and I collect them because they're hilarious. One of my favorites here is the 2030 food pyramid with antidepressants at the top and microplastics at the bottom. Or this comment I saw on Reddit, I eat a credit card every Sunday. Just get it out of the way and have a nice plastic-free week. So it's funny, but we're laughing at what we can't control. Well, what are we laughing at exactly? Well, where are the microplastics? So this is the race to research, and it's pretty recent. Some of the most actually, there were no findings in the human body prior to 2018 when microplastics were detected in human feces, which got investigators thinking like, oh, if we're passing microplastics, what are we not passing? January 2021, microplastics are located inside the human placenta on both sides, the fetal and the maternal side. And this was upsetting for lots of reasons, including the fact that the placenta was thought of as an impermeable barrier. Chemicals are not supposed to get through the placenta. Harmful items are not supposed to get through there, but they are. From there on, we see all kinds of findings: lung, meconium, sputum, blood, breast milk, liver, urine. The testes and semen, testes and semen. That one was another one that caught the investigative world and the medical world off guard or by surprise or just simply unhappily, because that is another of those barriers that is supposed to be impenetrable. That's supposed to be a safe zone. Nothing passes through that. Not true. Microplastics do. What else? Okay, heart tissue, kidney, carotid plaque, the brain. Okay, that was number three. That finding pretty much broke the internet. If you've ever heard of Matt Campen, he's the investigator who located microplastics in the brain, and that lab's pretty much on fire. Having figured out how to do that, they've been finding microplastics in a lot of interesting places. But okay, the upshot here is that we really find it pretty much everywhere in the body that we look. And we want to know, well, what does that mean? What kind of harm, if any, is that doing? Now, industry would love to tell you that it's inert. There's nothing to see here, folks. Plastic, it just sits there. Nothing. But that's not what the studies show. It's absolutely not what the animal models show. It's not what the in vitro models show. If you put microplastics in a petri dish with living cells, they tend to die. That's showing toxicity. But this was an interesting one. This was a study that came out in 2024 where people who had undergone endarterectomy, where they'd had plaque removed from their carotid arteries, um, the investigators looked at the plaque to say, okay, is there microplastic here? And in 58% of the patients, they found that yes, there was. They then followed those patients, all of them, forward, both those who had the plastics and also without the plastics. This is kind of the money shot up here, because what they found after 3 years was that those who had micro and nanoplastics in their carotid plaque had a 450% increase in heart attack, stroke, and premature death over those who didn't have micro and nanoplastic in their plaque. Now, this is just one study. I don't think that it's been replicated, and it's correlation, it's not causation, but it sends a tremendous signal that there is a there. Something is going on. And it has led to pretty much an avalanche of further research by people, including colleagues of Matt Campen, who are asking, like, how is it doing it? What is it doing? How is it harming venous tissue? What's happening here? And there's a lot now of cellular tissue level evidence and data demonstrating that, yeah, these plastics, they're having impacts. But this is Matt Campen, and this is the finding that really caught people, and people said, "Whoa, okay." So the Campen lab developed a method of looking at any kind of tissue and dissolving it in solution, and then taking what was left, and they use what's called pyrolysis GCMS to it's almost like incinerating. So they superheat it and then they look at the smoke and they analyze the chemical signals inside the smoke to understand what was in the material that they found. And what they found in the brain, they looked at brain tissue from two different groups of decedents. They looked at a group from 2016 and 2024, and they looked not just at the brain, but also liver and kidney. They chose liver and kidney because those are filtration organs, and we know that we commonly see microplastic and nanoplastic there for good reason. The body's trying to get rid of the stuff. So they looked at the brain, and not only did they find a lot in the brain, they found more in the brain than these other organs, which is not what they expected. Micro and nanoplastics were selectively accumulated into the human brain. Now, why is that? Well, the brain is very high energy and it's also very fat dense. It's very lipid oriented. And many of the additive chemicals in micro and nanoplastics move into fat readily. They're what's called lipophilic. So that's one way that they are probably being accumulated in the human brain. Another is the way that the brain kind of eats by taking in lipids. It brings them across the membranes selectively. So if you already have fats, lipids that have micro and nanoplastics in them, the brain is going to be looking for that and is going to actually, the membranes are the cellular membranes open to those kinds of molecules. They found that the brains of people who had a history of Alzheimer's or dementia had 5 to 10 times more plastic. Um, Now, we don't know what side the horse and the cart are on. Is the plastic causal? You're not usually supposed to say causal in medicine and science. It's like the C word. But which came first? We're not really sure. We do know that the blood-brain barrier in people who have Alzheimer's and dementia is more porous, so it could be allowing more plastic over, but we don't know that. It could be that it is causal or factorial in leading to dementia and Alzheimer's. So more research required. And then this is the one that really got my attention as slightly more of a generalist. They found that the concentration of plastic increased in the human brain by more than 50% between one group, the 2016 group, and the next, the 2024 group. This was so striking that they went back to other labs located elsewhere in the country to get their data on how much micro and nanoplastic was in those brains. They didn't get data, they got tissue samples and they analyzed them. And they found that this upward trajectory was consistent. They've also found it to be consistent in animal models. So some of the detractors of this study say, oh, well, the plastics, they look a lot like lipids anyway. And so, this is actually not plastic. This is fat, and people are more obese now. And so this is just obese brains. Frankly, I'm not sure if that's even medically possible, but it's certainly not happening in kangaroo rats and the other animal models that they've been looking at. So this is a trend that we're seeing. So why are we seeing this? Well, Campen thinks that it has to do with what we call the toxic debt, which is the amount of plastic that's just been accumulating in landfills and all over the place since we started mass producing plastic in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The physicists who study the way that plastic degrades have found that an ordinary piece of plastic will gradually go down to micro and nanoplastic. All plastic does it, by the way. It's an inevitable thing that happens to plastic. It all becomes micro and nanoplastic. But the time scale on plastic that's just lying around, ambient temperature, no particular stressor except for ordinary light and heat and existing in this world, is about 50 years. So it takes about 50 years, which is about the amount of time that we've had that stuff lying around. So the sense that we may be at a tipping point for bioavailable nanoplastic is really concerning the researchers. So here's some kittens. Just take a deep breath. Let it out. Okay, we're all still here. These are the theories, and they are backed by data and they're backed by very careful investigation, but they are theories. And this is a science that's changing constantly. So a year from now, I may have something very different to say, but these are the findings of the last couple of years. So how is it doing it? How is plastic making its impact? How is it harming us? Well, there are two sides of the ledger, and one side is as particles themselves in a place where they shouldn't be. What are they doing? Well, we know anytime you put plastic particles in tissue, that tissue becomes inflamed. You see reactive oxidative stress, and it could just be the stress of the particle rubbing up against the tissue. So that would be a particle effect. There's not really a lot known about how much of that is at stake here. Industry will tell you that because there isn't a lot known about the particle effect, we cannot draw any conclusions about anything. There's not enough data, and this is not a problem that we should be thinking about solving with regulatory solutions. But in saying that, they're trying to hide this side of the ledger, which is where we have decades of data. Those chemicals that are in the plastic, they are the plastic, leach out constantly, and we know what quite a few of them do. There are more unknowns than knowns, but the ones that we know about are scary. In some ways, it doesn't matter anyway. It's like the humidity versus the heat. You have the wet bulb going either way, but there is a distinction to be made. So the way that researchers think about microplastics in the human body from the chemical side is like that they're little Trojan horses. Those tiny particles sitting inside tissue are constantly releasing their payload of chemicals, and they'll just keep on doing that for as long as they're there. And this is that payload. We know that there are more than 16,000 chemicals that can go into the production of plastic. 26% of them are known to be hazardous, meaning they're carcinogenic, they're neurotoxicants, or they're hormone disruptors. This side of the ledger is the one that we're actually really worried about, though, because there are 66% that are totally unstudied. We don't know anything about what they do. But based on what we do know, the proportions are nervous-making. So how is it doing it? How is this migration happening? Well, this is the moment where you should know a tiny bit of the chemistry of plastic, and I won't stress you out with more chemistry than this. But a plastic polymer is a repeating unit, and it's held together with covalent bonds, holding the carbon backbone together. Covalent is super, super strong, very hard to break, which is why plastic is so resilient. So there are your bonds. Now we want to make it pink or floppy or UV resistant or waterproof. So we add chemical additives, and many of those are highly toxic. These are just a handful of the ones that are the best studied. And I won't get into any except phthalates, but just we know that they're on the do not eat list, right? Like you don't really want to be eating brominated flame retardants. When they're added to the molecule, they're not bound to the molecule. They just sit inside the matrix. And because they're just sitting there, they can migrate and do migrate out at every phase of plastic's existence. So if you take one thing from today's lecture, it's do not cook or microwave any food in a plastic container. When it says microwave safe, they're talking about the container, not the food. The food is getting the chemical load from the plastics that you're heating up. That energy activates it. So here's the part where we're really worried. Yes, I keep saying that, right? Like, what else are we worried about? But it's the endocrine part of the problem that has the investigators most concerned. Human endocrine system, this is homeostasis. This is how your body regulates itself. I had a professor last year. I took a special course on endocrine disrupting chemicals, and she asked 16 postdocs plus me, what are some hormone producing organs in the body? And it was a trick question because every organ in the body produces and functions on hormone. Even the skin has a precursor to vitamin D. So the whole body is hormone sensitive, and those hormones are the signaling system that conduct everything. They regulate metabolism, sleepiness, sex drive, aging, reproduction, you name it, they're governing it. If you want to, understand a little bit about how a body goes haywire when the hormone levels are out of balance, think about thyroid disorders, or insulin and diabetes. So those are worrying, but the periods of greatest vulnerability with this are the youngest people of all, especially prenatal development and infancy, but also toddlerhood. Think about it as the first 1,000 days of life. It's the timing of these disruptors that makes the poison, not the dose. Tiny, tiny, tiny doses can go a long way. If you happen to be a developing fetus, and for instance, you're going to need thyroid hormone in the first trimester for brain development, but you don't produce any yet because you don't have a thyroid. You need mom's thyroid. And if mom's thyroid is depressed because of the presence of these kinds of chemicals in her environment, you're getting lower levels and you're going to have some really disrupted development. When in prenatal life, those tiny quantities of hormones are a problem because the fetus isn't fully functional. It doesn't have DNA repair mechanisms. It doesn't have a competent immune system. It can't detoxify with enzymes. Its liver can't metabolize, and its blood-brain barrier isn't fully formed. So it can't fend off insults that we now understand are passing through the placenta and into the fetus. And also, this is the period when it's laying down the tissue that it's going to rely on for its body for its entire life. Cell differentiation is taking place here. Tissue formation is taking place. Even the receptors for future hormones are only now being formed. So, if you disrupt this, you create permanent structural changes that will follow this person through all of their life. Some of it might be visible at the time of birth, but most of it won't be. A lot of it will be triggered by later hormonal action that's supposed to take place and is itself interrupted. So, okay, it's interesting to notice that as we look at microplastics and their effects in animals and mammals, the studies, this is a study that was conducted in California, and researchers were looking for microplastics in systems throughout the body. And the ones that they found, they were correlated to negative health impacts, of which the top 10 were male reproductive health, including and especially sperm and testicles. In fact, much of what we understand about the impacts of plasticizing chemicals takes place in the world of reproductive toxicity, because that's where the effects are the most apparent. And that's because of the extraordinary sensitivity of the developing fetus. So Beth had asked me to focus on this because there's a really important movie that just came out, and this is all of it is so important to us as women, to children, and to male fertility also. I'm going to just talk about phthalates for a minute. So phthalates are a plasticizing additive. They're added to plastic to make it soft. So polyvinyl chloride is a type of plastic. It's made out of vinyl chloride, which is a carcinogen, and you get a lot of hard plastic piping that way. But if you add phthalates, you can make it soft. You can get rubber duckies, you can get squeeze bottles, you can get food packaging. You can also get IV tubing and other kinds of tubing. So phthalates are very, very, very common. 95% of the population has phthalates in their urine. They're completely ubiquitous. And as we've been studying what they are and what they do in the human body, we know, for instance, that they impair the gut microbiome. So IBS is related to microplastics. You see a correlation there. Also, Crohn's and other intestinal disorders, and phthalates are a culprit. But the place that they're an even bigger culprit in a very permanent and disturbing way is developmental and males. We often think about, fertility in terms of the female side of the coin, but there's actually a syndrome that's associated with phthalates and prenatal exposure. And what is it and how does it happen? Well, some phthalates, they show weak estrogen-like effects. They act like estrogen. They're better described usually as anti-androgenic, but when a fetus is exposed to these at periods of development, the researchers have observed all kinds of impacts on the resulting child. They find a shortened, what's called AGD for, in order to not have to say anogenital distance, but it's the distance between the base of the penis and the anus is shortened. Those males later in life generally turn up with a lower sperm count and higher infertility. They also see undistended testes. They see hypospadias, which is okay. So the urethra is not where the opening is not where it should be. This is on the uptick, by the way. We see again fertility issues later in life, and the animal models are showing the same thing. The effects appear together. They're a clustered syndrome. So this has a name, and that's what it is. And that's part of what this movie talks about. The movie is called The Plastic Detox. It follows an investigator named Shauna Swan, who's been researching this her whole life, her professional life. She's now 90. She is a powerhouse, but more on her in a minute. So other things that Shauna knows and we now know, and this is corroborated in a lot of other research, is that sperm count has been going down 1% a year since the 1970s. It's now down 50%. And that decrease is increasing in speed. So it's going down more faster. We don't know why, but we do know that our worlds and our exposures are suffused with things like phthalates, things like these kinds of toxicants. So that's the predictor. Other things that we know that phthalates can do, well, they restrict uterine growth. So the baby doesn't grow as much in the uterus as it should. There are reasons for that I can get into later, but you get a lot of preterm births. This team in New York City, Leo Tresand, calculated that 56,595 preterm births in the US in 2018 could be attributed to just phthalates, with an associated cost of $3.84 billion. Other impacts on the girls, early puberty. So prenatal exposure, puberty is now 2 months earlier. It's since the 1970s. The average age of onset of female puberty has come back 2 months each decade. So it's 2 months earlier every decade. As these girls age and mature, you see irregular periods, you see polycystic ovary syndrome, you see lower egg quality when they reach their childbearing years, increased risk of miscarriage, more preterm births among their children, and then later, increased risk of breast and uterine cancer. Any hormonally sensitive cancer moves on the uptick when you see phthalate exposure in utero. Um, I think always about how to get the messaging across. How do we make people listen? How do we make people care? And I thought as a group, you might kind of enjoy this. So this is a little bit just uh, me. Oh, sorry, I'll get to this in a sec. So this is the documentary about it. Shauna Swan is this investigator here. The documentary comes across. It's called The Plastic Detox, and she comes across as like Dr. Ruth. She's hilarious and frank and talking to people about anogenital distance, which is also called taint, and lots of other things. So she's funny and irreverent and very serious in her work, though. She works in this film with six couples who have been experiencing unexplained infertility for between 2 and 10 years. And what she does with them is talk to them about plasticizing chemicals, um, chemical additives from plastics, and what they can do to reproductive health. And then she walks them through their houses. There's actually a playbook. It's now been published, the plastic playbook. And she shows them the common items in their houses that we don't think of as plastic, but that are, and that contain pretty significant quantities of these kinds of chemicals, starting really in the kitchen. But also think carefully about the bedroom, about your linens, about your carpets, anything that you're exposed to a lot. So if it's food contact or you're simply around it all the time, she works with them to swap out the most pernicious of the plastics in their households. They're just daily contacts and in their diets. And they do that for 3 months. And she also follows the sperm counts of the guys and their motility. And the guys, the sperm counts go up, the motility goes up. Spoiler alert here, at the end of the film, at the end of production, film came out last month, there were 3 live births from these six couples. And not all the couples went all the way through. So this is anecdotal, right? This isn't clinical data that will get you into the New England Journal of Medicine, but Sean is using the experience of the film as the basis for writing a grant to study 150 couples and just reduce their daily exposures and watch what happens to their fertility because it improves. So in the world of messaging, because Sean is a master at that, I've been thinking, I have a 10-year-old daughter. She'll be 11 on Wednesday. And she's got a Girl Scout troop who are actually, they're really cool kids. Children understand basics of science. In fact, they love it. Chemical migration is really easy to teach children. They get it almost intuitively. So I've been teaching them about chemical migration, and I've been teaching them about some of these plasticizing chemicals and how it is that you make plastic, what goes into it. We've got a jar of oil, we've got a lump of coal, and we've got a bunch of jars of just, food coloring that say phthalates and so on. But as part of the display, the girls have labeled a number of dolls with some of these outcomes, negative health outcomes that can affect women and girls, and they're going to be tabling at Earth Day. I have a feeling they're going to make a splash. If there were a follow-up lecture, or maybe there will be someday, I'll tell you how it went. But this is the kind of thing that people listen to because these are the children who are directly impacted by the materials in their environment. So we'll see how that goes. But how are we going to solve this problem? Well, messaging is part of it, frankly. It's really hard to watch the plastic detox and not get motivated into action, even if that action is replacing your plastic cutting board. There are lots of ways to solve this. Elizabeth's going to go through some of the on the ground ones, but I want to emphasize that regulatory systems are really the most efficient and the most just because it costs a lot of money to replace your carpets and your, sofas and all of your kitchen gear. And frankly, I don't even recommend doing that. I recommend phasing things out and replacing them as they come due. But it's the regulatory systems that really get the change across. And the good news is, even before that documentary and before this Girl Scout troop goes out and gets me into a lot of trouble, the polling has been totally consistent. People hate microplastics in their bodies. They hate them in general. They especially hate them in their bodies. And as far as the health impacts go, this is the strongest form of messaging that's getting through to people. 78% of US voters support national policies to reduce single-use plastic foam. People everywhere want to reduce plastics, especially single-use ones. As you drill down on the medical side of the concern, that's where people get the most agitated. 65 and to 90% of people believe that plastics or microplastic pollution is very concerning as a human health problem, especially it's a risk in our food and our drinking water. If you ask them what they're most concerned about, it's the studies that have gotten the most publicity, the brain, the cardiac study, that they're the most concerned about. I have a feeling that if this documentary gains traction, we're going to see fertility and reproduction move much higher up. And frankly, the investigators are the most concerned about fertility and reproduction. We're also the most concerned, by the way, about neurodevelopment. You hear a lot from lawmakers that they don't want to, vote for these things because, well, they're going to lose their support. They're going to lose the lobbyists that pay for them to, campaign. They have a lot to lose, and that's been a problem in Albany, a really obvious problem. But frankly, according to polling, people would have a more favorable opinion toward lawmakers who support measures to reduce the production of plastics. So the voters know what they want. And the issue is getting the elected representatives to go with the will of the voters. Here's our opportunity in New York State, and frankly, this is the strongest legislative proposal in the world. We have more power in New York State if we get this thing across than anyone anywhere because the Plastics Reduction Treaty has stalled, the international treaty, that one's stalled. But if we can pass this Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act in New York State, it'll become a model act for other states. The other states understand that New York City, yeah, well, the city is. New York State in general is a tough cookie. Lots and lots of interest groups, lots of hurdles to navigate. By the time it can actually pass in New York State, it has legs everywhere. Also, this is a great testing ground. So by the time something gets to the point of actually passing, everybody's had a hand in it. It's at its most palatable zone. And lastly, and this is supremely important, the New York State economy is massive. There's not a producer who's going to say, "Oh, well, now we have to pay the costs of having our packaging recycled. It's not worth it to, this state only has what, 20 million people. I think I'll walk away from that market." So they will change their production habits. They will change their methods in order to keep the New York State market, and that's going to affect the supply chain in general and especially around adjacent states. So the bill, I always think it's kind of like a Christmas tree. It's got everything we wanted in it. You make it, you take it. Polluter pays. They have to clean up their packaging waste. Companies have to reduce the packaging that they produce by 30%. This cap is really important. There's a glide path to get there, though, over 12 years. Packaging has to meet a recycling rate of 70% after 12 years. And this is my favorite part. I like it so much, I put the S in twice. We get the toxicants out. The law bans over 17 of the worst offenders from food packaging, including phthalates. That is super important. So you can support this bill. The QR code here will take you to a sign-on letter that's being floated by Beyond Plastics to ask your legislators to co-sponsor and vote yes. If you take a photo of that or just use your cell phone right now to scan that QR code, add your signature. If you have more time, head on up to Albany. Beyond Plastics is hosting a rally and an advocacy day. These matter. This is your opportunity to go in front of your legislator or frankly any legislator and be heard, including the one from I was not from his district, but he tried to claim that people don't care, but hey, you have the information now to scare him because he has grandchildren. He has a wife. He has sons. This impacts all of us in really critical ways. Um, Sometimes the microplastics can really make you feel insignificant, but we have the power to change this. So thank you for your attention. And I think Elizabeth is going to talk us through some on the ground quick solutions, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Thank you so much, Megan. Before I get to the sustainable consumer recommendations, you all should know about a recent development regarding our municipal drinking water. As prescribed under the Safe Water Drinking Act in December of 2025, there were 7 governors who petitioned the Environmental Protection Agency to monitor microplastics in drinking water. They are Phil Murphy, New Jersey, Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan, John Carney from Delaware, J.B. Pritzker, Illinois, Wes Moore from Maryland, Tony Evers from Wisconsin, and Ned Lamont from Connecticut. Earlier in 2025, at the request of Food and Water Watch and Beyond Plastics, the League of Women Voters of New York State joined other NGOs in a letter requesting Governor Hochul to be one of the 7 governors to sign the petition to the EPA. Governor Hochul did not affirmatively follow through on the request. With the 7 state governors stepping up, though, the EPA is legally obligated to add to the water monitoring list the microplastics and whatever else was contained in the petition. As a result, Um, Earlier in April, Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy Jr. and EPA Commissioner Lee Zeldin announced a set of actions to safeguard drinking water from microplastics and the other constituents. Whether the tap water is actually monitored, though, for microplastics and the other designated constituents is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on because funding and personnel in an ever-shrinking EPA is going to be needed in order to enforce the water monitoring mandate. Now, with what you've learned thus far, let's consider your daily life and ways to mitigate exposure to plastics and microplastics. Air water filters work. HEPA, or high efficiency particulate air filters, are highly effective at trapping the airborne microplastics and nanoparticles. The Environmental Working Group has a database enabling people to check by zip code on the status of their tap water to see if it complies with federal health-based drinking water standards. And in addition, you can also test your water privately. Water filter systems using reverse osmosis can effectively remove microplastics, nanoparticles, and forever chemicals such as the PFAS. When plastic heats up, its chemical constituents can leach. When plastic ages, it degrades into microplastics and nanoparticles that enter our environment and us. Let's look first at a few relatable examples and then to better practices. Single-use plastic bags, containers, and bottles are primarily made from petroleum-derived polymers, as Megan said, together with additives, and including endocrine or hormone disruptors and PFAS forever chemicals for flexibility and durability. And when these types of plastics are exposed to heat from the food that they contain or from external heat sources or are otherwise reused repeatedly, the plastic can leach the additives and shed microplastics and nanoplastics into the food or beverage. So think about hot soup or hot entree takeout or bottled water exposed to sun. Another example, according to the National Institutes for Health, disposable paper cups we use for tea or coffee are coated with PFAS or forever chemicals or plastic lining like polyethylene for waterproofing. That when exposed to hot liquids can release more than 25,000 microplastic particles and various chemicals within 15 minutes. When the heat causes these coatings to break down, it allows the chemicals to enter the beverage itself. So these examples demonstrate that we can consume microplastics through food and water stored in plastic or receptacle lined with plastic. This method of exposure is one that we can control by the containers that we use. Consider the food chain apart from the plastic packaging example. A 2024 study by Ocean Conservancy and published in Food Safety magazine determined that nearly 90% of protein samples tested, that includes seafood, tofu, beef, pork, chicken, contained microplastics, with particles often originating from contaminated feed, water, and plastic packaging. Organic farming particles may reduce some contaminants, but it will not necessarily eliminate microplastics entirely. Buying from local farms with transparent practices can help. The Center for Biological Diversity projects that there will be more plastic than fish in the sea by 2050. That's a tough one. If you are a fish lover, some research suggests farmed fish may have a higher level of microplastic contamination from fish feed and the equipment. So opt instead for wild-caught fish such as cod, haddock, and salmon, which feed in deeper ocean layers where microplastic concentrations are typically lower. Even organic produce can contain microplastics. So to address this, buy locally sourced, unpacked produce, wash it thoroughly under running filtered water, and store it in glass or silicone. The ubiquity of plastic makes it clear that we need research and proactive policies regarding farming and processing to make our food supply safer. So we pass PREA, and we have more work to do. When it comes to takeout food, in and around 2022, many fast food restaurants, including Starbucks, Panera, McDonald's, Burger King, Chick-fil-A, Taco Bell, Wendy's, among others, committed to phasing out the PFAS forever chemicals in their packaging. And committing to do something is the first step, but it's on us to make sure that they have gotten it done. So when you go out to eat, bring a reusable non-plastic takeout container for leftovers, such as those made from food-grade silicone or sugarcane fiber or bamboo pulp. To tackle plastic at home, inventory your kitchen and your clothes closets for starters. And I think that Megan touched on some of this. In the kitchen, swap non-stick cookware such as Teflon for stainless steel or glass cookware. If you use a microwave oven, heat food in glass containers only. And at mealtime, use ceramic plates or bone china if you're entertaining, silver or stainless steel cutlery, and glassware or ceramic mugs for beverages. Store food in glass containers and use stainless steel water bottles. Opt for parchment paper with silicone coating and foil wrap instead of plastic wrap. Instead of Ziploc bags, opt for reusable silicone bags that come in a variety of sizes, and organic mesh and muslin bags. Check on the paper products you use. Even paperware that claims to be biodegradable can have a polyethylene coating. Opt instead for products made from sugarcane fibers. And to composters among us, whatever goes into the compost bin will be returned to the soil that grows our food. Avoid adding any item, including paper towels, that may contain chemicals or plastic constituents. Turning to clothing, as Megan alluded to, synthetic clothing, blankets, and other man-made household fibers can degrade into microplastics and become airborne and inhaled. And when laundered, synthetics can shed microplastic and nanoplastic particles in the wash and end up in wastewater. Consider the alternative, opt for cotton, wool, linen, and hemp clothing. Because as it ages and endures multiple washings, these fibers will not shed microplastic particles like their synthetic counterparts. I would recommend mamavation.com, MAMAVATION.com, for an analysis of products using hormone disrupting and forever chemicals. It has common sense consumer guidance. Check them out. And for carefully curated information on the climate and endocrine disruption science and public understanding of its effects on human and environmental health, I highly recommend subscribing to Environmental Health News. That's ehn.org. It is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization founded by Pete Myers. And as Megan has discussed, Dr. Shauna Swan has the new documentary Plastic Detox, which is another window into the topic with a happy ending. Let's take some questions, and then I will come back and we'll just say goodnight. But let's hear from you.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks so much, Megan. We've got a number of questions in the chat here, so we're going to start at the top and work our way down. Megan, you kind of answered, you did answer this, but I don't know if you want to provide any additional context or expand. But Nancy was wondering why it's taken until the last 6 or 7 years to realize that plastics break down into smaller pieces and are never gone.
That's a great question. Um, I'm always asking, like, did they know? Did they know that this would happen? Like, I always suspect malfeasance everywhere I look. And in this case, actually, I really didn't, it did not occur to most people, even in industry, that plastics would break down the way that they do. They were first noticed as microplastics on the beach in England by Richard Thompson, who's an oceanographer. I've worked with him. He had a handful of sand and he was just looking at the particles in it that were blue and purple, and realizing, like, this isn't sand. So the discovery of microplastics, that was in 2004. Nanoplastics are becoming detected more every single time that we improve the detection techniques. And that's happening constantly. So, like the Campen lab took a great leap forward on detecting nanoplastic because it's a size that, you just can't visualize it. There's no microscopy to see it. So basically, at this point, we're figuring it out now because we know to look for it. We know that it does this, and because the detection techniques are getting better as more people are focused on it.
Thanks, Megan. Um, Catherine is wondering when you were talking about phthalates, she was wondering if the stats that you were giving are for the US only or if they're worldwide.
The ones for Leo Trisond and preterm births are the US only. 95% of the population, that's a good question. I think that's US. Sometimes it's a distinction without a difference because these things are so ubiquitous that it doesn't change much. But there is certainly a critique to be made that, like, no one's testing in French Polynesia, right? Like, we don't have data because that's not where the researchers are. So a lot of the data is going to be US and, similar countries, Germany, England, it's developed nations that have pretty significant research apparatuses.
Makes sense. And I can't remember who mentioned this, so I'm not sure if this should go to you, Megan, or to you, Beth. But Rebecca was wondering if someone could share the website that was mentioned for checking your tap water by zip code. Does anyone have that?
That's Environmental Working Group.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So
EWG.
EWG, yeah.
Yeah.
G.org.
Dot
Okay.
org.
Yep, I just typed it in the chat there for folks who
Thank
are
you.
looking for it. And then Catherine is wondering if someone could address the Guardian article that calls micro and nanoplastic testing into question. Are either of you familiar with that
Oh.
article?
Very familiar. Yes, this has been all over my presentations. In fact, this is the first presentation that I pulled those slides out to save time. That was a fascinating article. There was actually a conference going on the day that that article was released. It was Matt Campen's Microplastics Research Conference in New Mexico, and there were 250 of us there who were all experts in this field. So we were a little surprised that that article happened to come out like on the one day that we were all in the same room. What was it and what was the issue? Well, what it was a fairly well-known journalist from The Guardian who's really earned a lot of accolades for very good climate reporting. Took a look at the he's also been doing microplastics reporting. His name is Damian Carrington. He took a look at the research and he said, wait a second, some of these findings have been pretty significantly challenged or questioned. Okay. And in particular, yes, the Campen findings, pyrolysis GCMS is a brand new technique. And the critique of that technique is that what you might be detecting that you think is polyethylene could just be lipids. They have a very similar chemical signature. However, that's not the only microplastic that they found. They found many, many, many different resins. They found basically all of the resins, and the PET went up over time. It didn't. It's consistent over time. So Campen is absolutely happy to say like, yeah, we probably are over representing PET because of that. But it's not that it's not there. It's just that the detection method itself isn't quite good enough to tell us what the quantity is. The other piece of the critique was it was that, well, there's so much pressure to publish, a lot of the science is probably sloppy. And, just look at all of these critiques. I will say this, the article itself was enormously sloppy. So the criticism of like, oh hey, this is sloppy science, look at this, it's just junk, came from two people. Two. One of them was a Dow chemist, the Dow company. He's the person who used the word it was in the headline, bombshell. He said he personally thinks that a lot of this looks sloppy. The other person is somebody who's well known to the scientists who work here in the field, who kind of likes to stir the pot on LinkedIn, gets a lot of clicks and that sort of thing. And in fact, his LinkedIn profile, like the very top of it says, "Hey, industry, hire me." Um, so in a LinkedIn post about a year ago, he had made a comment that the Campen research was a joke. It was just a joke. You know, it was a clown show. Like I said, there are real critiques of it, but neither of those two people who Carrington elevated as saying that, you know, this science is bunk were among the like the critique and the evidence then that Carrington marshaled to say, hey, they're probably right, is the fact that there's been criticism of the methods in the literature. Well, last time I checked, that's how science works. Science is a self-correcting system. So you come up with a new measurement technique, you find things, and then you publish the technique and the findings and your own reserve about, you know, what might have gone wrong there. You also submit it to peer review, and your peers also come back at you and say, you know, have you thought of this, this, and this? And then the other scientists who are reading the literature will write in and comment, or they'll, you know, they'll create their own techniques and they will also critique. So what Carrington elevated as a, you know, as this sort of rift in the science was frankly business as usual inside of research science. So, you know, on the floor at this conference, we were all walking around scratching our heads, saying, what even happened here? Like, this is not news, right? Yay, critiques of microplastic, not like research, not news at all. I have a personal theory about what might have happened. This is my personal theory. Um, um, because microplastic science is new, it changes constantly. A reporter who's covering it is vulnerable to discovering that something that they came out with, say, you know, last April has changed dramatically. And last April, they wrote a dramatic headline saying, hey, look, you know, microplastics over here doing this terrible thing. And now, you know, here we are 18 months later, and it turns out like, oh, that was a preliminary finding. And so they run the risk of being embarrassed if it does turn out that the technology or the science wasn't as accurate as they, as a journalist, not as a researcher, assumed that it was. So I suspect that this was defensive. You know, that this was a way of making sure that just in case something new comes out, because new stuff does come out, that the bases are covered, that like, hey, doubt has been cast. However, all of the contents of that article fit what we call the tobacco playbook. The seeding of doubt, the using small arguments inside the field and magnifying them to make them seem super important to impugn just one small piece of the method. In particular, what that article, you know, it distracted attention from is the consensus, just like the climate consensus, that yes, there are microplastics in the human body and they're probably causing damage. Yes, they are there. Really, the questions that we're all asking are how many and what is the damage and how is the damage? So it pulled that down. It manufactured doubt at a very critical time also. And, you know, I mean, having studied the history of how this happened in so many other industries, from asbestos and lead to opioids and so on, this is right on time. It's absolutely right on time. The article didn't, the only scientist they went after was Matt Campen himself, and he was allowed to speak in his defense. But it wasn't really scientists assailing scientists. It was something that came in from the side, brought in doubt, and a real splashy headline, which, by the way, the very next day, Slate published a thing about bring back black plastic. You know, your concerns about microplastics are overblown. Nothing to see here, folks. Right? So they created this doubt, they manufactured it, and the timing was exquisite. I do think that there were industry hands behind this. The timing, it came out in the midst of this conference, and there were reporters who were from mainstream news outlets who were at the conference. None of them wrote about the conference. All of them wrote about the Guardian article. So it sucked all of the attention away from any new research findings that were reported at that conference that would have otherwise made headlines and become concerning to the public. So they scooped the entire conference by timing that publication at that time. The main finding that you would have heard about but didn't is what I mentioned about the time scale that it takes for microplastics to break down into nanoplastics. That was really the thing that got mentioned at this conference that kind of sucker punched the audience. That timing, I mean, we're sitting on top of what looks like it could be a real tsunami of nanoplastic. And that would have made an interesting headline. So now you don't see any articles anywhere that mention microplastic science without then also mentioning doubt or disputed science, just like climate science. We've seen this film before, folks.
Thanks for that additional context, Megan. I think that's really important. And to your point, yes, this is certainly something we've seen before, whether, as you said, it's with the cigarette companies or climate change or what have you. So absolutely important to highlight. I think that we've got just two more questions probably. One is a health related question. So there are obviously some instances when we're taking care of our health where plastic is a necessity. So well, I don't know if this is the case. This is a question. Beverly wants to know, is it safe to use a neti pot daily since distilled water comes from a plastic jug? She's looked into making distilled water herself, but the process just doesn't seem feasible.
Yeah, I'd go with the risk benefit ratio on that. Keep using the neti pot. Since most of what we understand about microplastics and the associated chemicals, they're incremental. It's ongoing exposures. Your neti pot is only one small potential exposure, and the whatever it is that you're treating for with it is getting direct benefit. So hang on to your medications, folks. Don't anybody pull out your insulin pump. A lot of medications are coated in plastics. Don't stop taking your meds, right? Like every doctor who looks into this field will say the same thing. Like continue to maintain all of your medical treatments. Those are known issues with known solutions. Don't interrupt those solutions because these theories and these preliminary findings, yes, backed by some pretty scary theory and some pretty understandable outcomes, right? But it's still preliminary. Stay with your program.
Thanks, Megan. And then the last question, I know we've got a lot of really great comments in the chat, and someone did ask if all of these websites that were noted will be sent along with the recording and the presentation. Megan, do you mind if we send this presentation around?
No, not at all. Yeah,
Okay, all right,
I've got
great.
a lot of
Yes.
extra slides at the back. I'll just cut them out. They're distracting.
Okay. But so yes, all this information will be sent out.
Great.
But the last question that we have is from Louise. I know that she noted in the chat, she asked the question, washing plastic utensils or containers in the dishwasher is bad, to which you replied, yes, that it does release bisphenol. That's
Hmm.
okay.
Yeah.
And so she's wondering if we should then wash plastic utensils or containers in cold water only.
You can still use warm water. That recommendation comes mostly from Leo Trisand at NYU. And you get a lot of abrasion and just a lot of stress in the dishwasher, like high heat, very strong detergents, like what's in those pods. This is some strong stuff. So hand washing in warm soapy water is the way to go with your plastic utensils. And I like to think about it as the ick factor of like once we understand what's migrating out of our utensils and our plates, like we don't eat off of lead plates anymore. And we shouldn't really be eating off plastic either. As that sinks in over time, you will gradually find yourself setting aside those plastic utensils. I still have, plenty of stuff that every time I put it in the sink, I'm like, this is still here. It's a process.
Absolutely. Let's see. Do folks have any other kind of final questions? I know we're a little bit over time here, but this is a very engaging presentation. Thank you so much to you both. Any final questions before we wrap up for the evening? Okay.
Erica,
Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
yeah, I'm just going to ask you to put up that screen before, well, I'm going to have like a minute of remarks before
Oh,
we say goodnight. You put up the last picture?
perfect. I was just gonna
Yeah.
do that. That's great timing.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to just well, I want to thank Megan. We should all give her a round of applause. I know this is not easy information. And in response to, I think, what Nancy said, this is disturbing information, but, we are well positioned to be able to put our heads together and speak to our legislators to take responsible steps, I think, particularly about our food. because the public policy decisions and the consumer choices that we make today, they're having a cumulative impact to the health and function of our natural resources, our planet, us, and then our children, grandchildren, and then the generations of life yet to be born. And there are cumulative impacts. So to take the next best steps forward, please ask your respective assembly members and senators to vote for PREA, choose health-wise sustainable consumer purchases, conserve what you consume. Life in our shared planet is precious. These days, too much of it is plastic. If you have learned something tonight that could inspire a family member, friend, or colleague to make health-wise consumer choices in their own life, please share the recording of this program with them when it becomes available to you. And one more thing. Please use the League of Women Voters nonpartisan vote411.org voting tool to make a voting plan and vote in the midterm elections. Thank you all for joining us. Wishing you good health and a good night.